Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The move from saving to spending introduces a different kind of risk, where timing matters as much as returns. That shift can change outcomes quickly, especially in the early years of retirement. Certified financial planner Thiago Glieger of RMG Advisors joins me to walk through those risks and how to plan for them. Thiago, it's great to have you back. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Terry.
As we think about our investment portfolios, one of the things that changes as we age, I guess, is our risk tolerance and perhaps our risk profile. How do you help people start to think about that transition?
When we think about investing, the longer the time horizon that we are looking to, the more risk or the more aggressive the portfolio can be. So this is using things like the CS&I funds and the TSP when we're younger and starting our career, because we know over time those investments give us the growth that we are looking for. But that is over time. And so as we get closer and closer to not having as much time, then we have to look to other investments, and people start to wonder, should I not be as aggressive? What happens if the markets fall and I don't have as much time to recover anymore? And so their personal risk tolerance starts to reduce and become a little bit more conservative. People become more risk averse and start to look to things like the F fund or the G fund. And this is a natural transition because we want to protect what we've built, especially when we're going to need to use it the most.
But protecting that nest egg is one thing. Thinking about protecting it from risks of inflation and helping it hold its value is another. So, again, what do you think about in terms of risk diversification relative to return?
That's a really great point, because a lot of people use the term safe when they refer to the G fund. Safe from what? Safe from falling markets, safe from the loss of principal. But to your point, Terry, it's not safe from inflation protection, right? And when we think about the idea of needing to keep growing our money because costs get more and more expensive over time, and we want to maintain the lifestyle that we have today, we can't just shovel all of our money into the safe G fund and expect that we'll be able to afford our lifetime forever.
Even the life cycle funds tend to front load that equity risk and volatility and presume a low volatility, low risk allocation later in life. And even then, that might not be what's most suitable for an individual.
That's right. I think the TSP does a really nice job of blending the life cycle funds between a different form of risk tolerance depending how close you are to the date that you pick. So if you're looking out to 2070, well, that's a long time from today. So it's going to be very aggressive in the CS&I funds. If you're looking to the 2030, well, a lot of that is going to be in the G fund, because they know if you intend on accessing the money at 2030, which is just around the corner here in a few years, what if the markets fall today and don't recover for another 2 or 3 years, which is pretty average, 2 to 3 years for us to see a full recovery cycle.
So you've mentioned before this idea of market sequencing being a risk to retirees. What should Feds watch out for here?
There's something called sequence of returns risk, and this is one of the greatest risks that a retiree is going to face. And what it means in plain English is essentially suffering poor market returns right when you're going to draw from your portfolio, right? So not only are you reducing your value because you're taking money, but you're also reducing your value because the markets are falling. And so it's a double whammy effect here. And when we look at the long-term impact of something like that, you can have 2 retirees with the same long-term average return, but one that suffered bad sequence at the beginning of retirement may have a completely different trajectory than one that didn't. And so this is where we have to think carefully about how are we invested so that we are still protecting ourselves from that risk.
We always say you can't really time the market, but if that happens, if you're experiencing both market risk and volatility risk, how should a retiree plan to recover from that?
I think what's really important is that somebody think of their portfolio in retirement as having multiple different jobs. We have to use the money today to live our life, but we also still have to be growing some of the money in stocks long-term to be able to fund our lifestyle long-term, beat inflation, and so forth. So how do you accomplish both of these tasks? If we look at the portfolio in terms of buckets, and we kind of put some of the money in one bucket, some of the money in another bucket, the aggressive bucket is always the bucket that's going to be in stocks. And so if we're going to take money from a portfolio and the markets are dropping, well, if we can, let's try not to take money from the bucket that has lost a lot of value. Let's look at the bucket that is very safe, conservative, and that has been protected from that market volatility, and let's use that money. What that does, if you can create enough years of that short-term bucket, is it allows that aggressive bucket that fell in value, it gives it those 2, 3, 4, 5 years to recover back and recover those market losses that you experienced.
Thiago Glieger is a certified financial planner with RMG Advisors. Thiago, I think a lot of people, when they get to retirement, though, don't want to spend every day thinking about their portfolio and which buckets are up or down. So they want an easy answer to this, and maybe they assume that the G Fund is that easy answer. Is it?
You know, I think the G Fund is a really great tool, but it is just one tool in the toolbox. It is not your entire retirement strategy. I think sometimes the idea of that safeness that comes from the safe feeling of the G Fund, it's emotionally comfortable, but it can create a future shortfall, right? Where it's just not replenishing your spending and growing fast enough. You know, we talked about the G Fund really just being a conservative cash position. Of course, it's treasury because that's the way that it's structured. But cash-like investments are only going to give us some sort of principal protection, the government-backed security, because it's a treasury. And that's what we fund in the short term. But if we think about how do we invest longer term, I like the life cycle funds a little bit because they do create that blend for you. I tend to find them a little bit too conservative and too heavy in the G Fund, especially if you're aligning your retirement date with that target date fund. But there's nothing stopping you from saying, hey, if I'm going to start taking the money at 2030, you can still use the 2040 if you want, or the 2045, or any other mix that feels comfortable to you and allows your retirement plan to meet all of its spending needs.
So if going all in on safety isn't the right answer, how should retirees think about the appropriate risk that they should actually take across those buckets?
The number one job that a portfolio in the TSP and any other accounts someone has in before retirement is simply grow. When you are looking at retirement, the job changes to create something called cash flow, dollars in, dollars out. And cash flow is what I refer to as the heartbeat of retirement. It can't stop, right? We always need that cash flow to continue. So the very first step in developing a portfolio strategy for retirement is going to be figuring out, what is my life going to cost? How much money do I need? Because your portfolio is going to need to generate that with your first pension, with Social Security, the three-legged stool that we all know very well about. And only then can you start to say, okay, if I'm going to need $50,000 a year and I need that for the first 5 years of retirement, well, now you can take a chunk out of your portfolio and say, what investment is best for me to meet those first 5 years of investments that are conservative so that I can spend my life. And then you do that for the next 5 years and the next 5 years, and the next 5 years. And then you start to actually have a strategy in place so that when all hell breaks loose in the markets, and that day will come, you're prepared and you're ready to not make an emotional or biased decision.
We're talking about retirees who are actually starting to draw out that cash flow. What about people who maybe have 5 or 10 years before they're at retirement? How should they be thinking about balancing that portfolio today?
I would say that just as you're about to get off the exit off the highway on a ramp, you start to let off the gas pedal a little bit as you're coming up to the exit. You start to get into the merge lane and slow down before you actually take off that exit. And the same is true about investing. We want to be careful being too aggressive right up to retirement, because when we look back to market history, the average peak to trough, as we call it, or how long it takes for your portfolio to recover back to even again, is 2.5 years. But we've seen way longer than that. We've seen 5 years, we've seen 6 years, we've seen 7 years. So I really like to look a decade or less at a portfolio and start to identify, maybe I shouldn't be 100% stocks anymore. Is 80% the right answer? Is 70% the right answer? I think that can only be defined within the context of a financial plan. So everyone's a little bit different. But you don't want to just go from 100 miles an hour down to zero too quickly, because you're going to feel that pretty heavily.
Certified financial planner Thiago Glieger of RMG Advisors. Thiago, thanks as always.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.